Cody Leist here with Tim Stried, the Director of Information with the OHSAA. Tim, thanks for coming down here to Scioto County. What brings you here today?
Well, my pleasure being here. And, you know, in August, when we're gearing up for the school year, one of the things I like to do is get around and visit with newspapers and radio stations around the state. And wanted to make sure I come down to Portsmouth and see you guys and Roger over at the radio station and head back up to Chillicothe on my way back home to Columbus.
Now, last year, a lot of the news down here in Scioto County with the teams that they were playing down here, we had two teams going to state, with obviously with Wheelersburg making the state championship. That was one of the big story headlines. What are some of the things that you remember from last year were the biggest headlines for you guys up at the state?
Well, I tell you, Wheelersburg's baseball run was one of them. That was fun to see them do that, and with the freshman pitcher, and of course the other pitcher was a junior, and so I think they'll probably be really strong again this year. In the spring is interesting because we only have 4 state tournaments. We have baseball, softball, track and field, and boys tennis. The fall and the winter are so busy, and there's so many sports going on. We have 24 sports total. So, you know, the state tournaments are just really what we gear up for once we get into the regular season. Other than that, you know, right now the start of another school year means trying to educate the member schools on new eligibility rules and any new requirements we have out there. And the fall sports in particular, the 2 points of emphasis are the concussion regulations out there, and also the heat, stress, and illness prevention things we have out there. So we just try to stress those a lot with the schools. Today, actually, we have a new administrators workshop going on in Columbus that Dr. Ross is at, and some of our other administrators, that is really just trying to bring the new athletic directors around the state up to speed on what they need to do to follow OHSAA bylaws.
Now, what are the things that you talked about with concussions and all that? What are some of the other items that you guys are looking at this fall, or just this this academic or athletic year in general, that a lot of people should probably be looking for?
Well, you know, one of the things we're keeping a close eye on is will the member schools, through the petition route, have an item on the ballot next May to potentially split the tournaments into public and private. The last couple of years, we've had a referendum, a ballot item out there for schools to vote on that was not to split. It was to create a formula for which schools would be funneled through to determine what division they're in, because our goal is to keep all schools in the same tournaments, whether they're public or private. We look at every school the same, you know, whether they're public or private. But there's a growing trend out there that is coming from a group of superintendents in Northeast Ohio to have separate tournaments for public and private schools. We've said that we're not going to put that proposal out there for the schools, but the schools have a way through petition to request that to be on the ballot. It's been on the ballot twice before. It failed by a large margin both times. Personally, we hope it fails again because we want, you know, one tournament for both public and private schools. But we'll see what happens, and if they do follow through with that, that would be up for schools to vote on in May.
You talked about with the public and private. We have 2 schools down here that are technically non-public with Notre Dame and East. Obviously, the debate is with all the schools up in northeastern Ohio, now also southwestern Ohio. Now, with that being said, I mean, these schools down here, it seems like, do they go in and get the raw end of the deal here, or what do you feel like?
Well, I would think that if, especially schools in this part of the state, if there were separate tournaments for private schools, I think the schools down here might, as you said, get the raw end of the deal, because in southeast Ohio and in southern Ohio, there's not very many private schools compared to, like you said, the northeast part of the state and the southwest part of the state, where there are a lot of private schools and very large private schools. In Cleveland and in Cincinnati are some of the largest private schools in the state. So, you know, if there's a private school division, if you will, in football, or a couple of divisions probably, you could have some of the private schools, you know, along, you know, anywhere from Portsmouth up to Steubenville, driving a long way to play another private school because they're in the same tournament together. So I would say that's a good reason right there to hopefully keep everyone together, so that schools, especially, you know, anywhere from Claremont County up to Mahoney County, you know, they're going to all be in the same tournament.
Talk about with football now this year, or is it this year or next year coming up, where they're going to add the 7th division, and how much is that going to affect everybody? Yeah,
that's next year, where we'll go to 7 divisions in football. This is last year that we have 6, and you know, we're excited about that. You know, we've heard some feedback where they think it's watering down a little too much. I always try to remind folks that Idaho has 8 divisions in football, so I don't think we're doing too bad that we'll have 7. But, you know, football is the only sport where not every team makes the playoffs. And that is the case in a state like Indiana, for example, where every team makes the playoffs. But it's still a selective group of schools that make the playoffs in football. Right now with 6 divisions, I believe 26% of the schools qualify for the playoffs. Next year going to 7 divisions, there's obviously 4 more regions, and there's 32 teams extra that will make playoffs. You're then looking at about 31% of the schools make the playoffs, which is still a small number. You know, that's still less than a third of the teams make the postseason. And football in Ohio is so good, and we have so many good schools and talented players that we think giving that opportunity to 32 more schools is a good thing.
Another thing that everybody keeps on talking about is wanting to factor in some of the things such as tradition and socioeconomic factors. What's the progress on that?
Well, those 2 things in particular were a part of the proposal that the schools voted no on the last couple of years. It was a 3-part formula. One was your boundary factor, one was your socioeconomic factor, and one was the tradition factor. You know, the tradition factor in particular we heard negative feedback about, but I think if you looked at why it was in there, you'd understand. But, you know, the proposal, it was what it was. It failed twice. It was a close vote both times. We put that proposal out because we thought it made sense, that it encompassed every school, and it looked at why you were in the division you're in. And then, you know, based on how your athletic count came out at the end of the formula, determine what division you were in then. So, you know, I don't know if you'll see a proposal like that again anytime soon. We tried it twice, and the schools voted no twice. I think we're all just kind of waiting to see what happens with this potential proposal to split next year, if that is the proposal that comes down the tracks. But, you know, we'll just have to see what happens. But, you know, those 2 factors were a part of the old proposal that the schools voted no on.
One thing you see down here inside the county is open enrollment and how kids use that to their advantage to maybe move to schools for athletic purposes. One of the names most recently with Andrew Bendoff going back and forth between Portsmouth and Wheelersburg. What is the OHSAA doing to combat this kind of issue from happening?
Well, you know, we have a couple administrators that all they work on is eligibility, and you know, we have lots of transfer bylaws, and we have lots of exceptions, and they're essentially, the rule is that if you transfer from school A to school B, you are ineligible for a period of 1 year unless you meet one of the 11 exceptions. And our staff folks are experts in that area, and if a student can demonstrate that they fit into one of those 11 exceptions, then our staff could rule them eligible. Perhaps that's the case with the young student that you just named. I'm not familiar with that case exactly. But, you know, there's lots of, you know, there's 11 exceptions, and there's lots of kids that fit into one of those exceptions. The most common one being if you move. If your family moves from point A to point B across the state of Ohio, then you're going to meet one of those exceptions. Other than that, it's a little more narrow in scope, but they've been doing it a long time, and they know what they're doing. But, you know, our goal is that students begin their athletic career at a particular high school, and they stay there unless there's a good reason why they need to go to a different school. Just finding a better team or a better coach or a better program is not, in our mind, a good reason to transfer. You should be at the school where you're living.
There are sports such as volleyball, basketball, baseball, and softball where everybody goes into a district meeting and they draw up their brackets. With the Central District, it's an open bracket. The Southeast District, they have everything done by sectionals. One of the things that I noticed last year with, in one section in boys basketball, you had probably 4 or 5 of the best teams in Southeast District in one division playing in the same sectional. So that means you get one of them knocked out and they don't even make it to districts. Is there something where there's a push where they might go to open draws with every district in the state?
I haven't heard that, to be honest with you. And I should say I'm not an expert in the whole tournament draw end of how we set up our tournaments. I'm in the room when that happens, but, you know, as far as how each of the 6 districts then carry out their draw, whether it's an open draw, like you said, or a seeded draw, you know, so much of that is where coaches want to put their team on the bracket. And, you know, Southwest Ohio is a great example where, for example, there's 5 Division I districts, and one of those districts is going to be funneled up through Columbus. And for whatever reason, a lot of those coaches want to put their team end of the bracket where the district goes through Columbus, so they stay away from some of the other Southwest Ohio teams. It's really up to each school and each coach how their philosophy is on that. But you bring a good point, though, as far as will there be a uniformity in open draw versus seeded draw. There's been discussions about that, about how we want to address that going forward, because it is a little confusing sometimes.
Finally, here we have Mark Knapp, the superintendent at Wheelersburg. He was just elected into the board of directors. Kind of talk about what he brings to this group as he starts his term.
Yeah, well, we're excited to have Mark on the state board of directors. We just had our first board meeting of the state last week, and so it was a good way to get the school year started. A lot of people might not know that the state board of directors is made up of representatives from each of the 6 district athletic boards. So each of the 6 districts has their board that runs the sectional and district tournaments in their particular district. And then there's a method by representation between A school, AA school, AAA school, that those district board members rotate onto the state board. And so each of the districts has 2 of their district board members on the state board. So it's really neat just to have each of the 6 districts represented. And they got a lot of work to do. You know, every year there's a lot of work to do on the state board. They have so many issues that come onto their agenda to talk about. Everything from the concussion and the heat stress regulations that we talked about a minute ago to the public versus private debate. You know, there's so many big topics to talk about. The board meets once a month in Columbus, and we'll see how the school year unfolds.
Tim, thanks for your time. Tim Stried with the OHSAA. Thanks for your time.